So we're working our way through the Westminster Confession of Faith. I think this is about our 8th session, and we're just starting chapter 3, so we've got a way to go. And chapter 3 is entitled "Of God's Eternal Decree." So what do we mean by God's eternal decree? Well, the best summary of God's eternal decree is in the children's song, "He's got the whole world in his hands." So that might be a quicker way of doing it. It's just to sing the children's talk. They've pretty much got the idea there, but we're going to spend a bit longer with some biblical background. But that children's song is the eternal decree. God's got the whole world in his hands. So a decree means an order. If you decree something, a king, decree something, it means God orders something and it happens. And here in chapter 3 of the Westminster Confession, it is the decree. And so there's a debate as to whether we mean decree or decrees. Here it is the decree, one decree. In the larger catechism, written by the same people, it is decrees. So they have the idea of a few distinct decrees. So there's two ways of looking at it. So one way you can look at it is God has one decree, one plan, and his ideas are in eternity. So because God's thinking, if you like, is in eternity past, you can think of it as one big decree, one big idea, but you can break it up into discrete decrees that he gives. And theologians like to debate things, sometimes unnecessarily, as to what logical order they come in. Well, we're not going to do that tonight, or quite likely ever. But there you go, that's what some people talk about. So there's one decree, we can think of it as decrees. And in chapter 3, we're going to think about point 1 and 2 tonight, which are, if you like, sort of general things about God's decree. And then point 3 to point 8 is just about salvation, which we'll think about next time. We might do that in one go, we might do it in a couple. So we're thinking generally what we mean about God's decree. So I'll read you 3.1. So WCF 3.1. God, from all eternity, did, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass. Yet so as thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of the creatures, nor is the liberty or contingency, brackets possibility, of second causes taken away, but rather established. So before we tuck in, what is just thinking about why people write things at all, what's the historic context behind this? So if you were the first reader, we'll do this if we read a bit of the Bible, do this here. What are you thinking about the relevance of this if you were the first reader? Doesn't matter if you don't know the answer to that, but we have brought it up before. What things are going on as they wrote this? I can think of two things. One's more obvious than the other. So we're talking in the 1640s.
Church started the Reformation.
The church started the Reformation. So the Reformation's now, well, churches start the Reformations at different times, but England's about 100 years in. But that is relevant because 100 years in, there's plenty for us to argue about. So there is an argument about God's sovereignty going on. So that's one of the things. There's lots of discussions about what we mean by God's sovereignty. So that is part of the reason. What were you going to say, Graham?
I'm not sure, but the brink of civil war, or we're actually in civil war.
Yeah, so the English Civil War. So the English Civil War is, well, they're kind of overlapping. So they might be discussing this as war's broken out. So they were either, the assembly starts just before the Civil War and it carries on through the Civil War. So war is, I mean, one of the things about the news at the moment, some of you know him, David Robertson, said, we are naturally anxious, but actually what we have at the moment in the news is business as normal. That historically this is the norm, wars. We just had a very long time of peace in Europe. But so war was going on. Yeah, Fran.
Has the Armenian controversy happened yet, or is that later?
Something like it has happened. So I assumed it had happened, but now you made me doubt it. But there's been things like it before that, because it goes back to Pelagius in the 3rd century or whatever.
But when was the Synod of Dort? Is it after?
16, 18.
16, 18.
Yeah, so before that.
Zero, so this is
No, 1, 8.
Oh, 1 8.
Yeah. Yeah. So Arminianism and Amerindianism all predates this.
Yeah.
So
I've been beaten up for the other things, so.
I'm glad there was a Dutch person in the room. I was about to say with great authority, oh yes, it happened before then, and then we get caught out. So yeah, and so actually an interesting thing about the Synod of Dort and a similarity with Westminster Confession is that other people were brought in. So they had 2 representatives from the Church of England at the Synod of Dort. In the Westminster Assembly, although it's meant to be a Church of England debate, I mean, obviously different to the Church of England as we think of it now, but they had representatives from Scotland and Holland and France and other places. So they were bringing their contributions in because the English thought they were more reformed than us, so they want to hear what they've got to say. So there had been these debates in the past that the Dutch had slogged out for us, and there is some breadth here. There's more breadth than you'd find in some places. But a big idea in the back of their mind is that England's about to start fighting itself. So part of the motivation in writing these things is actually to comfort the people. That against the backdrop of civil war, they wrote these wars. Now, the other thing is, we flagged it already by talking about Arminius, but what kind of objections, when we look at the detail in a minute, but what kind of objections are people going to raise to the general idea about God's eternal decrees?
Can you ask the question again, please?
Yeah, so what kind of objections to this are people going to have? So obviously Arminius had one, even before this is written. So objecting to the idea that God has the whole world in his hands, including history.
Well, object on the grounds that God can't do evil, so how can there be evil in the world?
Yeah,
How can there be suffering?
we will come back to that one and not answer it properly. Yeah. So how can God be in control and there be suffering is an objection. It's a more modern objection, actually, in quite the form we get it.
Where does free will?
Where does free will come into it is a massive question, which we will sort of answer-ish, or at least say something
Because it's
about it.
also after, I suppose, the Dark Ages, so more influences from, other religions are probably coming into Europe.
Yeah. I mean, they've had Judaism, but now they have probably other things they'd be aware of. Well, a few things I should say. One of them is Arminianism, which is that's what Ruth was talking about with free will. That's Arminius was a person who objected to a lot of the Reformed teaching, and he had these 5 points. The Synod of Dort comes up with 5 points to counter it that we tend to call the 5 points of Calvinism. That's not much to do with Calvin. So Arminianism is this idea that we are free to choose God or not. The options put there, and then we have to choose. And that's very appealing in a number of ways. But actually, it doesn't have, people don't like the idea that God makes choices of either us or what happens in history. One of the problems with Arminianism is that it doesn't let God off the hook with the problem that they're trying to let God off the hook with, because God still makes everything. God still foreknows everything. God has the power to act and chooses not to. So the moral issue doesn't help God at all. A modern response is that God is like a master chess player. So he doesn't control things, but he's like a really good chess player who reacts to what goes on around him. The problem with that analogy, of course, is chess players pick up the pieces. So to some extent, God has to get his hands on. Philosophically, there's lots of questions about, we won't go down a philosophical black hole. There's all kinds of philosophy about without predestination, do we actually have, are our choices just random and so on. But just thinking about this evening, before I came here, I had cheese and onion pasties. And that has loads of questions about God's eternal decree, because Glad ordered Cornish pasties, but they delivered cheese pasties. And then I was completely free to not eat it, but you'd have a very different talk now if I had been hangry. And so there's all kinds of things that come into, as a silly example, but lots of things come into any decision we make. So, for example, your preferences, we all prefer things, don't we? We prefer, things to be funny or serious, or whatever it is. We have different tastes in music, clothes, and what have you. We have our preferences of what we eat. I am free to eat Brussels when they put in front of me, but I just somehow can't do it. That's a silly example. There's my ability. There are things that I'm able and unable to do that limits my choices. There's my upbringing and my values. So straight away, any choice I make, how free is it? So there's lots of questions about that. One of the big objections that Christians have to some of this is it's about cold fatalism. So there's, in other religions and philosophies, you have a determinism, a fatalism, that this is how it's going to be, and therefore everything else is just following along that path. But what we need to see here is this is not a cold fatalism, but the warm comfort of our Father. Now, sometimes the way we explain it, when we get down into details, it might sound cold, but actually the important thing to do is to step back and say this is meant to be a warm comfort to us. So there is a problem that some people have of misapplying this, that every time in the Bible, God's eternal decree, in any form that it comes in, is mentioned, it's for our comfort, not to make you start worrying about things or how, use it the right way. And also what we've said in other bits of the confession already is we need a category for mystery. Mystery doesn't just mean to go, I don't understand, it's a mystery, but it means there are some ideas in tension. So we thought the other week about God's oneness, threeness, and there's other things like that we thought about where the truth is in both extremes rather than a balance. And we just deal with the biblical data, which means sometimes there are bits that we just don't have the whole answer to. So the big idea is this: God from all eternity did by the most wise and holy counsel of his holy will freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass. So what we're saying is that God ordained whatever happens. So what you're seeing in the news, God ordained to happen. And this is according to his will and his wisdom. Now, he has access to information we do not have, which is why we struggle with it, among other reasons. And so there's a number of places in the Bible that teaches this. I'll just read one. Ephesians 1:11. In him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of his will. So an idea that lots of Christians will be familiar with and become comfortable with is that God predestines us. But actually, Paul in Ephesians goes a little bit further, and other bits of the Bible do as well, that actually he works all things according to the counsel of his will. So frequently it's seen in the Bible, or in the bits like Ephesians, the sort of more doctrine bits, or it comes up in the storyline, that God is in control, and he's in control over detail. And the purpose of that is his will, which includes our salvation, which ultimately means to be conformed to Christ. So where you eat, what you eat, where you live, when you blew your nose, a war in Ukraine is part of God's perfect plan. And because God is perfect, and because his knowledge is perfect, it means there needs to be no adapting. You see, when we do make plans, we are constantly adapting our plans because there are so many factors that are out of our control. And the last couple of years has reminded us of that we're not in control of what we do. So that's the big idea, but there are three caveats that we then get given. The first one is, yet so as thereby neither is God the author of sin, and then I'll do the rest of the sentence in a moment. So sin is not introduced by God. Not even he doesn't even put the idea of sin there. Now, the reason that might sound obvious, that God is the author of sin, but if we're saying that God ordered everything, so in his plan would include the fall of Adam and Eve, would include sinful acts, and yet they say God is not the author of sin. So James 1:13, let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. 1 John 1:5. This is the message we have heard from him and proclaim to you, that God is light and in him is no darkness at all. So they're saying there is no darkness in God. God does not tempt anyone or coax anyone to sin. He is morally unable to introduce sin. I mean, he's physically, we've talked about this before, he's physically able to pick things up and move things around as he wills, but he's morally, it is against his nature to sin or to lead anyone else that way. So although it's ordained and it's in a plan which includes people's sin, God is not the author of sin. And the Bible until recently, and so the Bible and until recently, all Christian traditions would have God innocent of that. And most ideas that would go down a different path are to excuse God of that. But actually we need to sort of hold those in tension. So to a point, this is mysterious. We don't understand how can God be author of this, ordaining this, yet not author of that. But Scripture seems to state two truths there. And the second caveat is, nor is violence offered to the will of the creatures. So it's saying that in God ordaining all that's to pass, it doesn't impact our will and responsibility. So you could say, my cheese and onion pasty earlier, God ordained before eternity passed that I would freely choose to eat my pasty. Or that if I go to a vending machine and pick a particular, or later on if this chocolate's come out later, I don't even know what I'm going to choose yet. It's exciting, isn't it? I don't even know which chocolate I'm going to choose, but God does, and he did from eternity past. And that I would do so freely. I do so under no compulsion from any other force. So our choices, our decisions, and our actions, including our prayers, are real and they're significant. So this is different to other sort of ideas out there that have a sort of determination about them, is that we are victims of determinism. We cannot help what's going on. And what the Bible's telling us is actually, no, that's not the case. So although God ordains all that happens, he ordains that the decisions that you will make freely. And the third thing is, it says, nor is the liberty or contingency, which means possibility, of second causes taken away, but rather established. So here's some Bible verses which show a both and, that God ordains and that people or other causes are responsible. So Acts 2:23, this Jesus delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. So God planned it in a definite way and he foreknew it. You crucified and killed him by hands of lawless men. John 19:11, Jesus answered him, you would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. So he's saying to Pilate, you've only got power because God gave you that power. And this person, Judas, who handed me over to you, he's going to be responsible for those actions, although it comes into God's plan. Proverbs 16:33, the lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. So what Proverbs shows is that not just our wills are compatible with God's sovereignty, but nature is, in this case, physics. So we throw something, but God knows, in fact, more than knows, he's determined how those things will land. So why did it rain? Well, not rain. Well, because of atmospheric effects, which God is sovereign over. Why did I do this action? Because I chose to. Why did I choose to? Well, there are lots of reasons why I chose to. Because I wanted to, or because I felt duty bound because of ideas that I've got, rightly or wrongly. But God is sovereign over those reasons I made those decisions freely. So that's 3.1. I almost certainly won't be able to answer any questions But what the divines are doing here is marking out the boundaries we find in the Bible. They're not attempting necessarily to explain it all, because we don't always know how this works. It'd be like trying to explain the highway code to an orange, I guess. It's how could we understand these things? But best I can, or any questions or clarifications might be another thing. Over to you for any questions. I'll do some application at the end.
Where did sin come from?
Where did sin come from? What does everyone else think? Yeah. Any ideas? It seems we can only say where sin didn't come from. So it doesn't come from God. So we have verses like the lamb who was slain before the foundation of the world. So God created the world, knowing it would fall, and that Jesus would come into the world to die for sinners. We know that Satan is a fallen angel who tempts Adam and Eve. So we can push back from Adam. Where did Adam and Eve get this idea from? We can push that back one stage. Where did Satan get his idea from? We know it's pride. But where does Satan have free agency? And that's where we get into sort of speculative ideas about, in God's mind, what order do these things happen in? Because obviously, if it's something's in eternity past, it happens at once in one sense. And then we're starting to go outside of what the Bible says. So the Bible doesn't really answer that question. It's not in a way that I've understood it. But it does have us as responsible. So Adam and Eve is responsible. So God doesn't say to them, it's not your fault, it's the devil's fault. The devil gets judged. But Adam and Eve are responsible in the way that we're still held responsible. Yara.
Do Adam and Eve have sort of more of a responsibility about their sins than we, because they chose to sin that then affected all people, whereas we are born with, we are still responsible about our sin, but we are born with sin. Yeah,
so we have inherited sin. So we're not entirely free in that respect. So our consciences are bound. We are broken, basically. As Christians, we're in the process of being repaired, but we're broken. So we are inclined to sin. Adam and Eve, interestingly, would not have been inclined to sin. They were truly free. So Eve's choice and Adam's choice were truly free choices. So and the impact is because we inherit from our first father. So that their impact is greater than ours. Although we share in their sin. So I'd sinned before I sinned. If that makes sense. Now, if we don't solve this tonight, you're in good company, because for 2,000 years, some very good minds have written long books that conclude, I don't really know. So don't feel bad about it if you don't understand it. We can just put out what it isn't, I think. And obviously God didn't want us to know some things in the detail we want to know. There's other things he gives us enormous detail. 3.2. Although God knows whatsoever may or can come to pass upon all supposed conditions, yet has he not decreed anything because he foresaw it as future, or as that which would come to pass upon such conditions. Sounds like a legal contract, but we can unpack it a little bit. This is about God's freedom, which is mentioned in the last section, that God does things freely. In the universe, really, God is the only truly free agent. And this is talking about his sovereignty over mere knowledge. So God does know everything, but it's more than just knowing. So although God knows whatever may or can come to pass upon all supposed conditions. So an example here is from Matthew 11. Jesus says, "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. And you, Capernaum, will you be exalted to heaven, or will you be brought down to Hades? For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day." So what we see in Jesus' words there is that there's more than just God knowing what has been in the past or what's to come next, but he also knows what would have been the case had things been different. So had Tyre seen what Chorazin had seen, there would be a different outcome. Now there's another question there. Why didn't Chorazin get to see, why didn't Tyre see what Chorazin saw? That's another question for another time. This section doesn't deal with, but a good question nonetheless. And there's a similar situation in 1 Samuel, and there's the reference there. There are various choices presented to David, and God knows the outcome of all of the choices. So David has a few avenues open to him. God knows what would happen if David goes down any one of those, and God knows which he will choose. So this is called middle knowledge. So God doesn't just know the past and the present and the future. He knows all permutations of what would have been, even though he knew that none of those would be taken. Yet, he has not decreed anything because he foresaw it as future or as that which would come to pass upon such conditions. Now, this is an important distinction between what the Westminster Assembly were saying and what they're arguing against. We mentioned Arminius. So this guy who, he's in a sense has no new ideas. These ideas have been in the church for a long time. But this idea that God gives us freedom, but he foresees everything. So God knows everything, but doesn't actually always do anything to influence our choices. What they're saying here is that God does not just know the future, but he brings the future about. So many Christians think God knows everything that will happen, including who will and won't be saved, but he does little or nothing to interfere. So what the Westminster Assembly is also ruling out is God needs to respond to situation and changes. For example, if I want to buy a car, I research the car, I choose the car, I know the shop that has the car, I've got the money in my pocket or about to transfer it, and then I go to buy the car and the salesman refuses to sell it to me for whatever reason. So I have to then respond to him. So I might try and talk him round, and maybe I'll chat him round and he'll win. Or I don't get the car, he's already sold it or decided not to sell it. So what do? Well, I go and buy an equivalent car for about the same price if I can. So it's not quite the same, but it will do me. And we kind of think that's how God works. He's responding to conditions around him all the time. That's not what God does. God gets what he had in mind exactly every time. That means in terms of those of us in the room, he knew that you would be saved, particularly. You know, why not your colleague next to you or whatever? The person that you are married to, the person that it wasn't that it was approximating to that would probably work. He knew exactly in eternity past that we would be here today, that we would have had a bizarre set of circumstances that our lives had taken, that's all made us end up in Chelmsford and at this church and come here this evening. Exactly that. And Romans 9:11 says, though they were not yet born and had done nothing either good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of him who calls. And a few verses later, so so then he has mercy on whomever he wills and hardens whoever he wills. So this is talking about the election of Israel and the rejection of Israel, or Israel's rejection of him, and talking about Jacob and Esau. And he's saying, before they were born, he made these decisions. God isn't responding to what happens in their life. It's before they were born. Now, when you read their life, you see how God's decision works out in their decisions. Jacob's a bit of a trickster. Esau despises his birthright. All these sort of things that happen, even their sinful choices, but is working out God's choice because he has mercy on whomever he will have mercy on and hardens whomever he wills. So notice these verses in Romans are not God responding or predicting. He's ordaining their response for his purpose. But in the narrative we see their choices lead to God's plan and they are responsible for them. We might be finishing early because you have fewer questions, but that's okay. So I'm going to open for some more questions, and then if we spend more time praying, I thought if I did the next bit it would take forever, so I've just done a short bit. Go on, Fran.
Is this responding to this idea that predestination is about God looking into the future and seeing who will believe in the gospel and sort of saying, okay, so that's who God has chosen because it's those he's seen will have faith?
Yeah, so a classic Arminian argument, evangelical Arminian argument, is this. It seems abhorrent that God would choose some and not others. And so, and clearly, in our experience and in what Scripture says, we do make choices and our choices are real. How could God judge us if our choices are robotic? And so how do you square that with the passages that says God elects or God chooses? So what they say is God sees into the future. He sees who will choose him and he chooses them. Can you see a problem with that? There's a couple of problems. I think it's obviously strange. It's slightly strange in the text, but I think what they're saying, what it gives the impression is that is some merit in us. So if all the choosing is on God's side, all the merit is on God. If God foresees who will choose him and says they're the chosen ones, then we get the credit for making the right choice.
Presumably also evacuates any sort of sense of comfort that God will keep.
Yeah, so in Arminianism proper, salvation is not, you're not assured of salvation, you lose your salvation. There is what the guy who was taught me at Oak Hill, Mike Ovey, used, I don't know if it's a phrase that he coined or if it's a real one, but what he calls classical English Arminianism. So it just seems to be, you don't even get this in Scotland or Wales, but an English thing is that it's Arminian until you're saved, then they become Calvinist and you can't lose it. So that's a peculiarly English thing, and relatively modern thing. So yeah, but you would have no assurance if it's down to your response all the time. This actually comes up later in the next few weeks.
With God's sovereignty, I go along fine. I totally believe it.
Yeah.
But then you'll hear of someone who is arguing for it, and they use the word allow rather than ordain.
Yeah.
And then that puts lots of people off because they think it's almost like they see it as a get-out clause. That allow is slightly softer than ordaining. But it's not, is it? Because allow is the same as.
Now, actually, I think we're going to talk about permission later on. And not tonight, but later on in the confession, permission comes up. But yeah, in some ways, allow, if you have power but allow it, it is the same as ordaining, isn't it? So an example is, for those of parents, is sometimes you see your children about to do something, I don't talk about toddlers, and that's going to be bad for them. And if it's something really bad, like they're going to electrocute themselves or pour boiling water, you grab them and you physically remove them from the situation. But there are some things, I can't think of any examples of me doing it, perhaps we never did this, which might make us bad parents, but sometimes people will allow their children to experience some pain so then not to do that again. I can't think of a good example now, but you let them do something, then they'll experience some moderate pain, then they'll know not to do that when it might be a more serious thing. So what did the parent allow it? Well, they allowed it, but in a proactive way, rather than a laissez-faire. It's because I was doing something else, I just didn't see it. So if it's allowing, it's a deliberate allowing, isn't it? Which doesn't let God off the hook.
No, I suppose what I'm saying is I think the word allow can often mislead.
Yeah.
Because it's as a deliberate act.
Yeah.
If you're standing in front of the swimming pool and you've got a drowning man in front of you and you don't pull your hand out, that's a deliberate act, not to save that person. So although you could say it's allowed.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear.
No, you are.
The
Yeah.
word
Yeah.
allow is always helpful.
Yeah.
Because it can seem slightly less ordained than it actually is.
Yes, I do. And so when you talk about the work of Satan, often it's like the idea of God unleashing him. So Satan has in mind what he wants to do, but God can restrain Satan, but also he can let Satan go. So it's allowing, but God only allows Satan to do things when it serves God's will for Satan to do that.
But it also ordains exactly what he will do when he sets up the leash, right?
Yes, exactly.
I suppose I just think of an analogy from my own work is that I could allow someone to not revise and do badly on a text, but I wouldn't say I'd ordain them to do that. Much rather they actually have made the right choice and revise. I just don't have the power to ordain. But
That's right.
I also don't force them to revise.
Yeah. But I suppose that's where the analogy with the teacher and God breaks down, because you only see to the end of their A-levels and the university application or work application, where God sees to the end of their life and their children's life and their grandchildren's life and all the people they meet. So, God may ordain that they fail their A-levels because actually that's best for his plan and for their good and so on. So yeah, and in fact, I remember seeing a discussion on some Christian TV thing, which I don't usually watch. It was a long time ago, and someone arguing for this said that the level of God's control is, people say, obviously people want God to guide them. Said, well, obviously not down to the particular house you live in. And he said, well, take something like Dunblane. So it doesn't really matter whether you live in number 313 or 319. It does when a jumbo jet falls on your street. That God knew which people would die. Now we'll come to why this is comfort in a moment. But God's in control of quite small detail, as well as the big things. You can ask more questions in a minute. There's a book on the Westminster Confession by Chad Van Dixel, and he said this at the end of this section, which I found really, I think I put a quote, I think it might have been notes. He said, the happy truth is that those who dispute the absolute lordship of God check their arguments at the door when they enter closets to pray. The sad truth is that those who defend a doctrine of divine sovereignty often complain when things do not go their own way, forgetting that they're grumbling against God. Now, I found that quite a stern rebuke to me, because I moan quite a lot. Now, I think all my moaning is justified, but actually it's not. So I moan about the weather. If I walk out like this with the dog and I get soaked, I'm really angry about it. I am annoyed about my health. For example, I had COVID a little while ago. I'm still not 100%. I still get confused in the middle of a sentence and get much tired in the evenings and things like that. I'm really annoyed about inflation and things. There's all kinds of things I get annoyed about. And so I'm annoyed with, Putin or whoever person in the car in front. But actually, I'm being annoyed with God's sovereignty when I get soaked, when something doesn't go my way. Because God's plan isn't always mapped onto my plan. But I think what this is a Bible truth that we can articulate and to a point understand, but we can't completely square all the information. So we may struggle with Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated, or I will have mercy on whom I have mercy. Because sometimes I want God to have mercy on different people. There's some people that I'd like him to have mercy on that it looks like he hasn't yet. I don't know if he ever will. But also, we hear in Romans 9, who are we to talk about to God? I did the Murray McShane Bible readings when getting towards the end of Job, and God to Job is, did you make the thunderclouds? Well, you don't really know what questions you're asking, or that I'm asking. But what they're saying here is God is absolutely sovereign over all of history, and we'll think about why that's a comfort for us in salvation next time. But everything you do matters at the same time. If you speed, you could say, well, that was in part of God's plan, yes, but you're responsible for that, and that you're responsible for all your good things that you do and bad things you do. And when you pray, there's a God who really listens in real time. When we do evangelism, something real is happening, that it's in real time. You heard the gospel and God opened your heart at that moment. It really happened then. So God always works in real time. It's not fatalism in the way we have in other religions that have a set outcome. So what we need to do when we read 3.1 is we're actually reading what's going to come next and what we've already had. So the early chapters we've already looked at, the authority of the Bible, and the Bible having all that we need and all the ways what we want, and also the bigness and the goodness of God. So this does emphasize again the bigness of God, but we also need to bear in mind the goodness of God. So how God uses this is for a good purpose. And then to come, we're going to think about liberty and permission. And in the next bit of chapter 3, we're going to think about calling and salvation. But before we close, any questions or queries or whatever, but we've thought about objections. So we thought about why this might be difficult to get our head around. We thought why people might not like it. But what's comforting about this? Why won't we find this good news? Even when we go, oh, he only has mercy on who he has mercy on. Why is it also good news? Why might we be comforted?
Well, that we know that God is sovereign.
Yeah. Why is that good?
Well, at least we know He's in control.
Mm.
Despite the mess we make,
Yeah.
He is still in control.
And sorry to sound like a toddler, but why is that good? That God, we make a mess, but God's in control.
Because we know God's good.
Yeah.
And I think because what you've just said, he is fully in control, he's fully sovereign, but he's also holy, holy, holy. He is absolutely just, he's absolutely good, he's absolutely pure. Like, he can't not, like, what he ordains can never be not just or not good or like.
Yes.
So when we see something happening and we don't really understand it or we struggle with it, it's sort of a comfort to know that at some point, like, this is still good because it plays out in his good and just plan.
Yeah, that's right. So I think we said this important in that because God's holy and just, he cannot make unjust things. But sometimes when we're in the thick of it, it does feel unjust. So, and you know, I've been in situations where I've spoken to a grieving mum, and she doesn't believe in God because a son died when he was young, and I have the theological answers, but that's not necessarily a good time to bring them all out. There are other things we can say and talk about and bring comfort to them and what have you. But I think one great comfort is we know the end. So God knows the end, and it's a good end. And so, you know, what Hugo said, we make a mess of pretty much most things if we're given enough time. But God is in control over the mess, and He's in control over the outcome, which is good. And because I think that is hard for us, because I'm finding the news hard. I found certain things that happen to people here and to me hard, and you think, on, God, throw me a bone here. But actually, he's doing something that is good, that I have to trust him. And we remember, don't we, when we were children, that sometimes we had to trust our parents or someone else in authority over us, and we weren't quite sure about where this was going, and it turned out to be good. But that was only over a few minutes. With God, we've got our lifespan with which we need to trust him. Sorry, Hugo.
Well, we don't always see the whole perspective, because, well, with your example, if you get soaked,
Yeah.
that also means that the plants and nature gets watered.
Yeah, but they didn't have to be watered when I was out. That's
But when you're soaked, that's maybe not a good moment to tell you.
Yeah.
But in the end, we also know that in the bigger picture,
yeah.
there's good happening.
That's right. Yeah,
You might feel like it.
no, and you look at the news at the moment, and you can't see, what good can come out of this. Well, I don't know, but there may be all kinds of good that come out of this. And sometimes you think about the good that does come out of bad, and you think, wasn't there an easier way? But actually, we don't know all the dimensions to what God is saying. And there's spiritual dimensions as well, which we rarely think about. But there's spiritual dimensions behind all these things as well. Sorry, Fran, you can say something.
Yeah, no, I've just really enjoyed listening to what people have said.
Maybe one more thing is, I think we've touched on it in an earlier session as well, is sort of that God's judgment is always good. So if we see judgment happening, it might be uncomfortable, and it might be doesn't feel great. But it's so good because judgment from God is good. So you might not understand it, and we find it horrible that thousands of people die. But ultimately, God's judgment is still good.
That's right, and actually that's an important perspective we sometimes miss. I think this is going to come up later in the confession, but actually God is judging the world. So end of John 3, it talks about God's judgment is actually on us now, on the world now. So we often think that the world just ticks along, and then God's judgment comes and he separates. But actually God's judgment is now, and then at some point there'll be the separation, which will be new creation, new heavens and earth, or hell. But there is a judgment now. So the world, things go on in the world as they do because we are under God's judgment. The curse of sin is death, and disease, and so on. So that's the important thing not to overlook. I had another thing as well that was related to that you said. It's gone out of my head already. It was so good as well. Go on, Fran.
Yeah, so I've heard a number of times people, when something very bad happens, I think you may have mentioned this in sermons, kind of talk about such a that wasn't God, but kind of, or kind of, but God is working through it, or and often we'll kind of contrast, like the devil did that, but God, that wasn't God. Like,
Yeah.
what would you say about how might you kind of not lead people into thinking like that? Because I don't know that's quite right based on what you said.
Yeah, my answer just shot through my head and back out the other side again. To start asking it again and see if it comes back in my head.
So often if there's, like I had a friend who was working in Tajikistan, and then he somehow came under the spectre of the KGB equivalent and basically got kicked out. And his kind of response to it was kind of, I just couldn't believe that this was God doing this. And then I started to wonder.
That's the idea. Yeah. So I think as well, comfort, this sort of relates to that. But I've got to say what's in my head is that one of the comforts I think in this is that nothing is wasted. So why KGB Kazakhstan? We don't know why God would do that, but we do know that his experience isn't a wasted experience. Now, sometimes I can't see the good God is doing here, but because I can't see something doesn't make it untrue, because there's lots of things that I can't see a quark. I'm not even sure what a quark is, but I know that they're true. Well, we think they're true. So God is doing something good, and that no experience is wasted. So a bereavement that you have, and there's actually, that's not just the death of a loved one, there's lots of things we grieve, lots of wasted opportunities or things that have happened to us that we grieve for, or ways we perhaps have been abused or whatever, that none of that was a waste of time. It's something probably I feel sometimes, and I think probably that's just because I'm a child of my culture, is I get particularly annoyed about wasting time, particularly if it's a very long period of time. I don't just mean waiting in the shops, but sort of like if you're waiting for, I don't know, something for the doctors or whatever it is, and they keep you waiting for 6 months or a year or whatever, and you think, I could have got on with my life or whatever. That is not wasted time with God. Yeah, so what people may not write books about us or whatever in the future, but God has got you here now doing what you're doing was no accident any more than who's in the White House or Buckingham Palace. And that's quite helpful, actually, isn't it, when you think about that?
And I can say it's like, it is reassurized that, yeah, like the evil has some kind of power, and Satan has power, but only in the short term, because we know long term, like, God has won. And I think that's also just some faith that we have to say, yeah, we do see Satan's power in this world currently, but we do have faith that God lets that be because he's already won long term.
Yeah.
So I think that's also just that right. We have to sort of, we can say that, yeah, Satan has done that, but we do have faith that this is not out of the control of God, and that we ultimately that's not going to do anything.
Yeah, and also when we read the Bible, we have like a bird's eye view over history, of that bit of history, that we don't get now. And so we can't always say, oh, this is happening because of that, where in the Bible we see Satan's schemes move to Satan's downfall every time. We don't see that in, so we don't know. And it's interesting, I've been reading a lot of news in the last couple of weeks, and one of the things is, 5 ways, depending on who you read, 5 ways, 10 ways, the war will end in Ukraine. And you're going, well, there's one way it's going to end, which is the way God's ordained it to end. I have no idea what that is. Putin has no idea what that is. And British intelligence doesn't know what that is. So we don't have the perspective of eternity to see why things are the way they are. But God is working his purposes out, as we sing sometimes. And it comes from Habakkuk. God's working his purposes out until the earth is filled with the glory of God as the waters cover the sea. It'd be good to close and to pray, and I'll stop recording.